For our meditation this morning, let's go on a mental journey back through time, 200 years. We're in Bernardston in January 1816. Imagine you've come to this very building, although it doesn't have a steeple yet, and Ed tells me it was across closer to I-91. The minister, Timothy Rogers, has arrived perhaps on horseback, perhaps towing a sleigh, perhaps on foot. The roads of Bernardston aren't yet plowed or paved. There's no such thing as a snowplow or the gas to run it. In the church, there's no thermostat that automatically starts a fire when it gets cold, no propane tank that pipes fuel to a furnace without human intervention. The only heat comes from burning wood. The only light from the windows and from candles, and perhaps some of the congregation brought little iron boxes of hot coals from the hearth at home to warm their feet during the service. A major job of the church sexton is to cut and split firewood, carry it into the church, build a fire, and keep it tended. There is no running water, no electric coffee pots for the tea, no coffee probably, because that was an expensive import and Boston was a tough week's ride away. Everyone comes to the service on foot, on horseback, perhaps in a sleigh, and some of these people are buried in the graveyard just to our south. There are no TVs, no cell phones, radios, or telephones. Even the telegraph won't be invented for another 21 years. In cities like Boston, some people are burning a new fuel called coal in their fireplaces because the forests around Boston had mostly been cut down. There's no oil, no gasoline or kerosene. The first oil well in America won't be drilled for another 40 years or more. The rich burn whale oil in their lamps, but the common people burn candles of tallow or had lamps burning extracts of pine tar and alcohol. Farther to the south of the Mason-Dixon line, millions of people of African descent are held in slavery. It's only been 8 years since Congress outlawed the importation of any new slaves. The minister in Greenfield still has a slave, they say, though the Massachusetts courts have effectively freed them. The recently invented cotton gin is making cloth more affordable at the cost of needing more slaves to grow and pick the cotton. Now, there are some radicals who think that this is wrong and that slavery should be abolished, but what are you going to do? Slavery is essential to the economy. Everything has to be done by human or animal power or a few small water mills. Let's meditate for a time on this world not so many generations away from us and consider how different our world is, for better and for worse. It's pretty clear that the most important task for humankind in the 21st century will be to make the transition away from the fossil fuel economy and build a new world fueled by non-polluting, renewable energy. And this issue is to us today what the issue of slavery was in this church 200 years ago. It may well be that our children's children's children in the year 2216 will look back on us the same way we look back on our ancestors who accepted slavery. They may wonder why we were so immoral as to drive cars using gasoline, heat our homes and churches with oil or gas, and make electricity with coal, despite the advice of the most learned scientists of our time. This isn't just an economic, political, or technical challenge. It's a moral one. And just as our Unitarian ancestors fought against slavery, our denomination is led by its conscience to ending the threat of climate change. There are theological reasons for this. Few religions are as this worldly as ours is. We don't see our lives as merely a prelude to a more important one in heaven. We don't expect to be able to screw up the earth and have a divine Savior come and blow away all the carbon dioxide. Neither do we believe that an apocalypse is coming anyway that will destroy the earth and make everything irrelevant anyhow. We see stewardship of this earth as a religious duty, and we've recognized that in our seventh principle and in several General Assembly resolutions. Now, we're not unique in this. Most religions recognize the obligation to be good stewards of the world. And in the end, it will be moral and ethical forces that get us off of fossil fuels because spreadsheets and politics aren't pointing in that direction. Religion, love it or hate it, is one of the only forces that can stand up against commercialization and the exploitation of people and the planet. Now, this year, Pope Francis issued a major encyclical about climate change, which is an astounding and powerful document we all should read. One of the Pope's major themes, and this is the theme of this sermon more than anything else, is that climate change is linked to exploitation of the poor and economic inequality. A single-minded idealization of the environment while dismissing human beings as consuming, polluting plague on the earth is an ideology that goes against our first principle, affirming the inherent worth and dignity of all people. Furthermore, it will not get us where we want to go, and I think that was the point of the New York Times editorial. Waste and pollution are certainly immoral, but we might be able to build a healthy, growing world economy that benefits without them. Growth doesn't have to come by burning the Earth's savings account as we have for the past 200 years. We're smarter than that now. Now, what I found refreshing about that article is that while he agrees that we have to leave all the fossil fuels in the ground, he reminds us of the good things that fossil energy has helped to bring about. Democracy, women's emancipation, the end of slavery. If we insist that the only way to save our planet is to shrink the world economy, he says we'd make a mistake just as if we'd make a mistake by continuing to pump CO2 into our greenhouse planet. Now, we have to remember that energy multiplies human effort. The economics are so basic that we take them for granted. A carpenter with power tools can build better houses in less time than she could with a hammer and handsaw. A farmer can plow more ground with a tractor than he could with an oxen and hired field hands or slaves. A person in a car driving on asphalt-covered roads can get supplies in an hour that used to take hours over muddy, rutted roads. Most people in New England today keep ourselves warm in the winter without having to spend the effort to time to burn wood, stoking the stove and hauling the ashes away every few hours. Energy is a crucial component in everybody's personal productivity. Convenient, affordable energy gives us the gift of time to do other things. Energy multiplies our efforts, it empowers us. Now, while there's romance in the simple life out here in the country that uses less technology, what about the huge proportion of humanity that lives in cities? There isn't enough kindling on Boston Common to warm any of the townhouses facing it. If we were to cut our energy consumption to 1/60th of what it is now, which is what we need to do to avoid runaway warming, billions of people in cities worldwide would face conditions not faced since the siege of Stalingrad during World War II. The other proposition he puts out is that growth makes war less likely. Most of us believe that today's world is more warlike than it was in the past. Turns out the opposite, by the numbers, is true. Human beings are much less likely to die in conflict today than they were in ancient times. To grow, Genghis Khan and Julius Caesar had to invade and subdue their neighbors, take their resources, enslaving their people. In an advanced society, each nation can create its own resources and trade with its neighbors, and that's made possible in large part by cheap energy. When an economy is energized to grow beyond the subsistence level, when people use energy to make things for themselves and have a lot left over, trade begins. People who trade depend on each other. And when they depend on each other, they're not inclined to kill each other. And the example that comes to my mind as a former international businessman is China. When I was growing up, we were afraid of Red China. Remember that? Works of fiction, movies forecast that their growing population would run out of resources and start a nuclear war. Trade was essentially prohibited between our countries, and most Chinese were living at a subsistence level. Now, we have many differences still, but today they depend upon us as consumers, and we depend upon them as suppliers. That trade, despite its downsides, for their environment and for our working class makes a war between us a non-option for both sides. Through growth, China has lifted a huge number of its people out of poverty. Because of prosperity, their population has stabilized. This incredible economic growth in China was fueled by coal. Now China produces 28% of worldwide greenhouse gas emissions. That's more than the US and Europe combined. But they're not idiots. They know what will happen to their oceanside cities like Hong Kong if sea levels rise 10 feet from melting glaciers. Their carbon emissions in China peaked in 2013 and have declined slightly. The Chinese are making major efforts, more than us, to convert to renewable energy. Their people hate the smog that covers their cities like Beijing, but even this is less damaging than the fallout from a nuclear war that some predicted as inevitable just 40, 50 years ago. Fossil fuel is also partially responsible for the formation of a middle class and the end of slavery. Slavery and indentured servitude and its close cousin, serfdom, was common in the medieval world. Peasants supported a thin layer of aristocrats, but even the aristocrats lived in conditions we'd experience as primitive. Women in pre-modern times were little better than slaves. To do the laundry before washing machines took hours of manual labor. Cooking meant grinding grain into flour and loading wood into stoves. They made clothing with spinning wheels and looms powered by the power of their feet. Without refrigeration, you couldn't buy food for a week in advance. Feeding the family wasn't popping something into the microwave. And so why send your daughter to be educated, to learn about history or language when her life will be occupied with domestic chores? And the harnessing of first water power, then the advent of electricity drastically cut this situation of semi-enforced labor. And then women could do other things, could be educated. We usually focus on the political side of the suffragette movement, but these economic changes were a necessary prerequisite to emancipation. It's no coincidence that in those parts of the world where industrial revolution has only recently arrived, women are the least liberated. Let's keep these points in mind as we work towards a carbon-free future. We can do a lot, most of it, with conservation and efficiency, using energy more wisely. But even after every home and church and factory has been double glazed and insulated, we'll still need to make a huge amount of renewable energy available to replace all the fossil fuels, or there will be major social dislocations. Our Earth needs to be defended, but so do the people on it. These two defenses have to be intertwined. If we continue to let the atmosphere be used as an open sewer for the fossil fuel industry, billions of people, and most of them in poor countries like Bangladesh and island nations in the South Pacific, they'll pay the price. But if our solution to the climate crisis doesn't aggressively develop a new renewable energy system that's available and as inexpensive as fossil fuels, if we don't defend human needs as legitimate too, a necessary part of the program, the people won't be on our side and will fail to win the battle. And that kind of dystopia we don't need. Now, the first place I was exposed to this perspective, that environmentalism and social justice need to go hand in hand, was in this book, In Defense of People, by a minister, Richard Newhouse. I read this in my first college theology class. It was written by a social activist minister working for the poor in Brooklyn, and in his eyes, environmentalism is too often an effort by rich people to keep poor people out of their parks. He argues that the view of people as an invasive plant that needs to be controlled, that sees each baby born as a demand on limited resources instead of being a resource in itself, is totally incompatible with the Christian view of humanity. Now, that made an impression on me that has lasted to this day. Even something as benign as environmentalism can be bent into a repressive tool by elites. Some argue that we have to stop growth altogether and shrink the population. Just yesterday, the op-ed in the Recorder floated the idea that 7 billion people on the planet are perhaps too many, and suggested 1 billion as a possible, proper, sustainable level. Now, those ideas make a simple kind of sense, but I no longer find them convincing or workable. We're living in a complex, adaptive system that makes it impossible to reliably calculate a formula saying there should be this many people and no more. I've seen these formulas since 1970 just fall one after the other. I don't think humans are a plague on the planet that would be better off without us. I think, and this is a little woo-woo, I think the Earth evolved humanity for a reason. More on that later. Now, one of my favorite energy experts, and he's a great guy, is Amory Lovins of the Rocky Mountain Institute. And he said once, "I'm an environmentalist who likes cold beer and hot showers." And like him, I just don't buy into this puritanical hair shirt strain that's sort of attracted to the idea that it's too late and everything's going to fall apart and that's a good thing. I reject environmental apocalypticism the same way I rejected religious apocalypticism. We have two major problems facing us, though, and that don't have anything to do with hitting the wall of resource depletion. One is the huge money behind fossil fuels. And the oil and gas industry has so much money and power behind it, they'll use that money to protect their interest until the last drop of oil has been pumped, if we let them. Now, here's a simple, easy-to-figure, back-of-the-envelope calculation. I drove through Greenfield this morning. The price of regular gas is $1.93 a gallon. It hasn't been that cheap in my records for 12 years. Now, just a few years ago, the average price in Greenfield was $3.60. That, by my calculation, tells me that gasoline sales alone put $224 billion a year of pure profit into the pockets of the oil industry and the elites of petrostates. That's enough money to buy Washington and every state house several times over and still have enough money to power their private jets. This is an industry that literally pumps money out of the ground. That money buys power, it buys propaganda, and it buys advocates who undermine and attack alternative energy projects. They want to keep their golden goose. Now, the second problem we face is there are so many possible alternatives that don't use fossil fuels, nobody knows which one to gamble on. Right now, solar panels look like the slam dunk, but in 10 years, they could become obsolete if someone comes up with an inexpensive way to crack the hydrogen out of water. There's always the possibility that physicists will develop a cold fusion process, releasing nuclear energy without creating radioactive waste products. There are biologists working with the algae that eat sewage and produce something like diesel fuel. We don't really understand yet the full nature of photosynthesis, which is the entire method by which energy is stored on this planet up to this time. Bill Gates and several other billionaires in Paris have put together a process to try to invest in these alternatives. But nobody knows which is going to be the winner. And nobody wants to invest in the wrong side, to be holding, that technology that winds up getting recycled. Given this situation, my radical policy proposal can be summarized in 4 letters. ABFF. Anything but fossil fuel. In my view, we have to develop as much renewable energy from as many sources as quickly as possible and get smarter about the energy we use. In President Carter's words, we need to declare the moral equivalent of war. We can't afford to be overly fussy about every new alternative energy project if we want to make the entire oil and gas industry obsolete in our lifetime. The atmosphere is holding a gun to our head, and that will affect us more than any group of terrorists ever can. A switch from the concentrated power of the fossil fuel and nuclear industries into a widely distributed network of renewable energy, there's no way around it. It's going to affect the way that Franklin County looks. Lower impact doesn't mean no impact, but if that keeps the climate from running out of control and the glaciers from melting, so be it, I say. And yet, when a group of farmers wanted to put some windmills up on a hill in Shelburne, the town voted against it because of the noise impact. I didn't hear a similar noise impact about the 16,000 gas and diesel cars that drive across Shelburne on Route 2 every day, or the railroad locomotives that echo up and down the Deerfield River Valley. I say ABFF. A struggling golf course in Greenfield wants to use 13 acres of its land to put in a 2-megawatt solar panel array that will help Meadowbrook Golf Course stay open and provide solar energy to the town, but they have to get a zoning variance and jump through several hoops to do so. Again, I say ABFF. All alternative energy projects have their downsides. Change is never a zero-sum game. But these are small compared with, say, a huge fracked gas pipeline crossing the entire county. That makes the biofuel plant that was shot down in Greenfield look like it was a great idea in comparison. And that TPP pipeline might happen because it's favored by law, politics, history, habit, and most of all by money. Solar, wind, and water face an uphill climb, and we shouldn't be adding any more weight to their load. Anything but fossil fuels. It's the job of us in rural communities to provide urban areas with food, fuel, and fiber. We like the romance of seeing cows grazing on a green hillside, but does that give us the right to say a farmer can't put in a solar array because it spoils our view? We have to allow that minor environmental impact to avoid much worse results but if we continue to use coal, gas, and nuclear to make the electricity we need. There is no perfect future. To hold that alternative energy should have no negative impacts at all, that is Pollyannish. If solar arrays in country fields can keep coal companies from blowing off entire mountaintops in West Virginia and filling their streams with tailings, that's a net gain as far as I'm concerned, quite apart from the CO2 issue. ABFF. On conclusion, it's time to play a requiem for fossil fuel. Thank it for the bounty it has bestowed on us and replace it BTU for BTU. The 200 years that human beings have been fueling our economies with carbon have led to enormous changes in how we see ourselves and our planet. Back in 1816, everyone in this church thought that the planet was created in 6 literal days, that human beings were co-created in the Garden of Eden at the same time as every other plant and animal, about 7,000 years ago. None of our ancestors had a clue about the billions of years it took humans to appear after the formation of our planet, or that those strange footprints in the rocks weren't made by animals getting off of Noah's Ark, but by dinosaurs who had lived hundreds of millions of years ago on a very different Earth. You know, the biblical flood story is a gentle fable compared to the story we've learned that 67 million years ago, the whole ecosystem of Earth was destroyed by an asteroid that slammed into our planet and vaporized everything that wasn't several feet underground or under the sea. 200 years ago, people were only beginning to understand that the air around us is composed of different elements. A Unitarian minister, Joseph Priestley, had discovered oxygen in 1774. They gazed into the fires that they built in their homes to keep warm, and they didn't know that oxygen was combining with carbon in a chemical molecular reaction. If you told them that the coal in the forge at the blacksmith shop was once a living thing containing the energy of ancient sunlight stored by plants 300 to 400 million years ago, they would have thought you were crazy, possessed by a devil, denying the Bible. Yet, it was the very effort to understand where those fossils came from that led us to a truer understanding of the history of our planet. Today, we know that the sky itself is a paper-thin layer of gas protecting the Earth from an assault of meteorites and asteroids traveling through space. It's a unique mix of molecules that keeps just enough of the warmth of the sun in and radiates just enough heat back out into the blackness of space to create our current environment in which all life thrives. The growth of science and technology was fueled and inspired by ancient carbon. And we should all be grateful to that layer of subterranean fuel that multiplied human strength, that freed us from drudgery, that made ancient conflicts irrelevant. If you take a spiritual view of it, that carbon was placed there by a loving creator to prime the pump of humanity, to help us take care of the earth. It was an underground savings account, a treasure buried by Mother Earth hundreds of millions of years ago. And now it's time to stop living off those savings, to stop consuming energy and start creating. It's to invest that ancient treasure to build an entirely different energy grid that lets human society thrive and grow without the terrible side effects of skies darkened by smog, ice caps melting, and oceans rising. Would the Earth be better off if humans never evolved to use tools and to dig and explore? We might think so in the short run. But in the long run, no other species was motivated to shoot rockets into space, to track the comets and meteors that one day could create another apocalypse, wiping out all species on the top of the Earth. Only a complex, technologically advanced human society could protect the Earth from another asteroid impact. The damage we have done is terrible. But in the long run, we may have evolved with the purpose of saving the planet. Our awareness and curiosity, our greed, even our warlike instincts, balanced with our awe and love for the beauty of all life, can serve that great purpose. If humans aren't here to protect the planet, odds are that eventually another mass extinction will fall on Earth, just as it ended the age of the dinosaurs. Looked at this way, fossil fuel was the seed corn for a more productive, less wasteful society. It was an initial investment of energy, like an IPO, fueling a startup that is expected to produce its own revenue, not keep feeding on its seed corn. When renewable energy becomes the standard, when going to the gas station is as outdated as driving to Blockbuster to get a videotape, when electricity becomes almost too cheap to meter, the 3 billion people who are now living on less than $2.50 a day could be lifted out of poverty into the dignity of living a life where basic needs are met. Now, conservatives call this a liberal utopian dream, and many deny that global warming is even really a problem. And next month, I'll probably talk about the danger to the world of a new aristocracy that really wants to turn back the clock on human rights and equality. We resolve to forswear our foolish ways. We realize we can't go on the way we have been, yet it's also foolish to deny the abundance of our universe, the possibilities that intelligence might unlock, the desires of humanity for a fulfilling life free from poverty and free from conflict over limited resources. Hopefully, 200 years from today, happy people will gather in this church to celebrate what our time began to bring about. May it be so.